You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 7th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, after President Zelensky receives a hero's welcome from one veteran on the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Oh, you're the savior of the people. Here's to my eyes. Got a picture.
Yeah, you want a picture?
I hear
France announces fighter jets and training to be supplied to Ukraine. We'll examine whether this changes Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Also ahead, 3 football fans are arrested in Hong Kong after turning their backs during the playing of the Chinese national anthem at a World Cup qualifier. We'll have the latest. Plus,
this has been the most extraordinary experience of my entire life.
Are you ready for it?
I'll be your host this evening. My name is Taylor, and welcome to the Eras Tour.
And as Taylor Swift kicks off the UK leg of her record-breaking tour, we'll explore why things aren't going as smoothly at stadiums for other artists. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Now, 2 stories in the last 24 hours highlight just how much of a shift in society there's been in Hong Kong in recent years. The first is the news that 3 people have been arrested for turning their backs and remaining seated when China's national anthem was played before Hong Kong's home World Cup qualifier against Iran. The second is that 2 of the last remaining British judges to sit on Hong Kong's top court have resigned, with one citing the political situation in the former colony. Well, Shibani Mahtani is a Singapore-based international investigative correspondent for The Washington Post. She was previously the paper's Hong Kong bureau chief. I'm delighted to say she joins us on the line now. Good afternoon to you, Shibani.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Just explain to us what happened at this football match, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of as you say, right? Since there's a law that passed a couple of years ago against insulting the national anthem, the Chinese national anthem in Hong Kong, and since then, people have been much more sort of tepid about showing their dissatisfaction against the state or against the anthem. In the past, you would have football matches where it was explicitly booed, or people would be much more explicitly showing their displeasure. In this case, as you say, it was just 3 people who kind of turned their back and, were not sort of vociferously singing the anthem. But, even that was enough for them to be arrested. According to local media reports, there were plainclothes police among the crowd filming them and making sure that, nobody was sort of like desecrating the anthem or so on. But yeah, I mean, this used to be sort of like par for the cause, right? At sporting events, it used to be one of the many kind of forums that Hong Kong people had to show their displeasure against the Chinese government and Chinese rule. And, the fact that, as you say, that this is like even so curtailed now is a real indication of quite how far things have gone in Hong Kong.
Indeed, it's a sign that the slightest transgression is held up as an example.
Absolutely. And I think, again, the reason why the Hong Kong authorities are so sensitive about, the national anthem is because, for so long, right, it was this big symbol of China's dominance that people would find any opportunity to reject. As you know, during the Hong Kong protests in 2019, Hong Kongers really wrote their own alternative anthem. It's called Glory to Hong Kong, that the Hong Kong government has also moved to ban. It's put a lot of pressure on Google and other tech companies to remove that from streaming platforms. Even Spotify, has taken it down. And it really is about creating that singular Hong Kong identity to be tied in with that, mainland Chinese identity and loyalty, right? And just removing any form of showing displeasure against Chinese rule in Hong Kong.
So what's been the reaction to these arrests?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, this idea of the ridiculousness of it, I think has definitely been, shared all over my Twitter feeds and so on. But as you say, right, if there's so little space to show any form of dissent, right, you're not going to see a huge reaction to it. I think a lot of Hong Kongers have become very numb to this idea that each thing gets more and more ridiculous, right? I mean, a few months ago we had somebody arrested for wearing a T-shirt with a slogan on it. I think it's just like highlighting the sort of farcical nature of the way these laws are being implemented now.
And it does suggest that those who do wish to protest do so in the full knowledge that there will be severe sanctions for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it really does show, that the sort of cost, right, of showing displeasure just keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And, the sort of space is obviously getting tighter and tighter to express that.
Let's move on to the second story that's come out of Hong Kong. This resignation of these judges from Hong Kong's top court. I mean, who are they and why have they left?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal is a sort of holdover from sort of colonial times, but also from the common law system there, has a number of foreign judges, including from the UK, from Canada, and, under the new sort of regime that has come into place under the national security law, right, where you saw this like imposition of Chinese law and Chinese authority on top of the common law system, there has been a ton of pressure for these people to resign. And that's been, very concerted pressure that's happened over the past few years, right? And the idea that, they're sitting there on the Court of Final Appeal just sort of justifies, right, that, nothing's changed in Hong Kong and so on and so forth, and kind of puts more of a fig leaf on the fact that rule of law is still, being held up as it were. And, I think this coming right after the verdicts that found, 16 people guilty for running in a primary election just last week, right? I think the timing of that has put even more pressure on these judges to resign.
What kind of role may they still play, though? I mean, given the context, one could be considered to be surprised by the fact that there is still more than one British judge still inside the Hong Kong legal system.
Yeah, totally. And it means actually that there are still, a number of overseas judges that continue to sit on the court. I mean, the fact of the matter, right, is that they serve in a private capacity and they're paid quite a lot of money to, sit on the Court of Final Appeal. They get paid something like £40,000 per visit when they fly into Hong Kong to sit on certain cases, and so I think part of that, there's like a huge incentive for them to stay on, right? But financially, it's a pretty easy job. It's like a kind of temporary job as well. But I think the idea and a lot of, human rights activists, a lot of Hong Kongers have been pushing, right, is that this just adds sort of legitimacy to a system that's been fundamentally broken and a system that really, has been very corrupted and co-opted since the passage of the national security law.
Shabina Maitani, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to The Briefing, live on Monocle Radio with me, Emma Nelson. A quick summary now of today's headlines. Here's Vincent McAviney.
Thanks, Emma. 4 days of voting are underway across the European Union, with Dutch voters casting their ballots yesterday. Exit polls suggest left-wing parties in the Netherlands have narrowly won the most votes, slightly ahead of the right-wing party of Geert Wilders. Over 373 million Europeans are eligible to vote in the world's second-largest election after India's. Final results won't be released until every country has voted late on Sunday evening. US President Joe Biden is meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in Paris today to discuss a package of $225 million in weapons on the sidelines of the D-Day commemorations. This is the leaders' first face-to-face meeting since Zelensky visited Washington, D.C. back in December. They will meet again next week at the G7 summit in Italy. Colombia's government has said it will begin formal peace talks later this month with left-wing rebel group Second Marcatilla. The group is a split off from FARC, which had signed a peace deal back in 2016. The talks are part of President Gustavo Petro's plan to bring total peace to Colombia. And Germany is looking into buying 8 additional F-35 fighter jets made by the US defense giant Lockheed Martin, on top of the 35 it had already ordered in 2022. The F-35s will be stationed at an airbase near the western German town of Buchel from 2027 and could also carry American nuclear weapons. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Vinny. The time here in London is just nudging 10 minutes past midday. You're listening to The Briefing. Now, France is to supply Ukraine with Mirage fighter jets to help Kyiv in its defence against the Russian invasion. It's not known how many jets will be delivered or when, but it adds to a growing number of nations prepared to answer Ukraine's call. Well, Julia Lasker is writer and researcher at Monocle, and she joins me now. Very good afternoon to you, Julia.
Good afternoon.
So what's been agreed?
So from what we understand, as you said, no certain number, but there is a plan that by the end of the year there will be these Mirage jets on Ukrainian soil flying in Ukrainian skies, and they will be training pilots to commandeer them and working with a coalition. They're forming a coalition of countries who have Mirage jets to talk about how they can supply them to Ukraine.
Tell us a little bit more about this coalition that's coming together. The fact is this is now a moment when people are finally, in the eyes of Kyiv at least, stepping up to help. So we have the Mirage jets. What else do we have on the list of what's coming from where?
So absolutely. So there's been, the big announcement that's kind of building up now and hopefully will be delivered very soon are the F-16 jets, and that's going to make a huge difference. Sweden also recently announced a package to Ukraine of their Saab reconnaissance planes. They were supposed to be also delivering their Gripen jets, also made by Saab, but they halted plans because they were pressured by other countries into allowing Ukraine to focus on the F-16s. So interesting, actually, that Macron has gone ahead with this Mirage announcement. Clearly, there's kind of a new momentum building that maybe wasn't even there 2 weeks ago.
It's funny because you mentioned this sort of building up of momentum, but what it was in February this year that Macron reiterated his commitment to supporting Ukraine for as long as necessary, yet it was refusing to supply fighter jets to Ukraine then. What do you think's changed?
I think what's happening is that people, leaders of countries are changing the way they see Ukraine, that it's becoming more of a trusted partner. They're realising also that the stakes are incredibly high. Ukraine has lost territory now to Russia. Not a huge amount, but still territory that it had taken back a year and a bit ago. So I think, recognition that the stakes are incredibly high, that Russia is not in any way at all ramping down the pressure on Ukraine. If anything, it's just getting higher and higher. We can see that with the energy strikes as well. They're striking huge infrastructure in Ukraine, dams, entire dams. And, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the Kakhovka Dam. That was the enormous dam that Russia destroyed a year ago. And that was an enormous ecological human disaster. And so I think that they're realising that really Putin is not ramping down the pressure and they have to kind of get stronger, and they're seeing Ukraine more as a trusted partner as well. They're kind of waking up to what Ukraine can do, the capabilities of Ukrainians.
So it does actually beg the question that this supply of jets and this coming together of NATO partners, at least, to help Ukraine. The call has been coming from Ukraine for a very, very long time to help them defend their country in the skies. What difference do you think it would have made if people had answered this call earlier?
Enormous. In the first few days of the full-scale invasion, there were entire long lines of tanks just moving towards Kyiv, from the Belarusian border towards Kyiv. Can you imagine? That would never ever have been a possibility if they'd had fighter jets, if they were able to coordinate the skies, close the skies. So much energy infrastructure has been lost. So many civilian lives have been destroyed. Flats, homes, buildings. All of this because Ukraine can't coordinate over the sky, can't control their own airspace. This is what Ukrainians were calling from the first days of the full-scale invasion, to close the Ukrainian sky. Those calls were not heeded. And now Ukrainian homes are sitting in darkness, in blackout, because infrastructure has been hit. And this could all have been avoided. But, of course, thankfully, allies are waking up to Ukrainian capabilities to control their own airspace. But that's, a right that every country must have.
There will be a moment when there will be a reaction back from Russia, which will, obviously from the day one, the thing that has stopped everybody from participating to the degree that Ukraine has asked for is we cannot turn this into a NATO war. And there will be a moment when country after country will then start to participate and Russia will decide that it is now a NATO war. How prepared is Ukraine, and indeed is everybody, for that moment to come?
So, of course, that's a gamble. But what's happening now is also the rhetoric around that is changing. There have been so many nuclear threats. I mean, weekly on Medvedev, the former Russian Prime Minister's Telegram channel, that it's sort of becoming almost ridiculous. Don't do this. This is a red line. Oh, you've crossed it. OK, well, there's nothing we can do. It was the same when they were warning Nordic countries not to join NATO. If you do this, there's empty threat after empty threat. And they think that's what they... Ukrainians often call Putin a playground bully because that's what he is. He gives this threat, and then you have to sort of understand, okay, it's empty. You sort of can edge his red lines. He's edging our red lines, and we can do the same for him. But obviously, there's caution, there's real world caution to be mixed in with all of that. But I think here, showing bravery rather than cowardice in the face of threats is the right way forward.
What does Ukraine ask for next? It's one of those... absolutely inexhaustible supply of weapons and ammunition and now military jets are being sent to Ukraine to help. There will be more requests from Ukraine. What do we think that those are going to be? And will the rest of the world be able to step up once again?
Long-term support. That's what Ukraine needs. We are just on a roller coaster now of 1 month there's absolutely nothing. It's a dry desert of supplies. The next, it sort of all comes flooding in. What we need is concrete long-term support. There are countries that have been giving that. For example, Sweden, in its latest package, the biggest package yet, they reiterated a 3-year-long plan of how when weapons will arrive, when ammunition will be delivered, when things will be serviced that they've already given. And other countries are doing the same. Some countries like Estonia are totally emptying their entire ammunition stocks to Ukraine, and they're doing this again in a long-term plan. But I think what America needs to supply, of course, as the most important ally in terms of how much they're able to give, is long-term support, long-term commitment. That's difficult, of course, because there's the election coming up.
Julie, we have to state now that you are Ukrainian. How's the news gone down in Ukraine? Given the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky was at D-Day yesterday and he was embraced so warmly by veterans, it was an astonishing moment, wasn't it, where the past and the immediacy of conflict were arm in arm?
Absolutely. I think it's really painful, to be honest, because historically Ukraine has not been fortunate in these wars. It has lost, even though there have been these moments of bravery and national resistance and independence. But Ukrainians are now sorely hoping that this will not be like the rest of history, that D-Day, in Ukraine, in Poland, in the ex-Soviet states was not a moment of victory. Unfortunately, it was another moment of empire and colonization. So this is a fresh time. This is new history that's being formed.
Julia Lassiger, writer, researcher and Ukrainian at Monocle. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Briefing. $13.18 in Brussels, which is where we head now, because how much have Europe's young voters given up on their politics and their politicians? The coverage of this weekend's forthcoming European parliamentary elections is stuffed full of warnings about the lack of interest from anyone under 35. Well, things are being done across the bloc to stimulate interest, widespread advertising campaigns and a promise from some countries to lower the voting age. Well, Dave Synoday is a professor of political science at the Free University of Brussels, and he joins me now. Good afternoon, Dave. Let's start by saying, just explain to us, how interested are young people in the European elections this weekend?
Well, what goes for voters in general also goes for younger voters. They are not a homogeneous bloc. The younger voter doesn't exist. So there are certainly young people that are quite interested in politics, just like there are older people who couldn't care less. So I don't necessarily think that this interest is necessarily totally age related. I think there are more important differences according to education level, gender, immigration background, other sociodemographics, which just means that younger voters are not a homogeneous bloc.
Nonetheless, there is a feeling. I think we were talking to, if you hear from some Czech voters or some Croatian voters have pointed out that the average age of an MEP is 53, and therefore you end up, just by the dint of who's representing you in Parliament, having a Parliament which isn't representative of a vast slice of the continent.
Yes, that's a totally different issue. Indeed, if you look at the average age, especially in the European Parliament, it is quite high, and so you can indeed say that that younger people are less well represented. Even though doesn't necessarily mean that older MEPs can't also think about interests of young people, or it doesn't necessarily mean that all young people have the same interests. But it's true that that can be considered as problematic. Yeah.
And so, explain a little bit about which countries are trying to address this. And trying to encourage participation by extending the franchise. Which countries are deciding to lower the vote this time around, the voting age?
Yes, so there are 4 countries in the EU where the voting age has been lowered to 16. So that's Belgium, a country where I come from. There, it's even obligatory, compulsory for people of 16 and 17 to vote for the European elections, because we have in general a compulsory vote system in Belgium. Next to Belgium, also Germany, Austria, and Malta, and in Greece the age is 17. So these countries have indeed decided to lower the age, partially in an attempt to increase interest and attention for politics and more precisely for the European elections among young people. And indeed, research shows that the younger people are stimulated to engage themselves with politics, the higher the chances are that they will remain interested in politics the rest of their lives. So from that point of view, I am quite favorable of lowering this age to 16. However, there are a lot of 16, 17-year-olds who themselves don't necessarily think it's a good idea, because they consider themselves as being too young and not enough knowledgeable about politics yet.
I mean, it's good to see that if you engage people young, they will stay and become more engaged as they grow older. But let's look at the countries that we're talking about here. We have Germany, we have Austria. They are countries at the moment which are grappling with the far right. And the far right is doing all it can to try and harness a disaffected spirit in both Austria, particularly in Austria. How much are the far right targeting younger voters?
Well, they're very strongly targeting younger voters, especially also through social media. A recent study showed that while MEPs from the radical right and the radical left combined only have about 1 in 6 seats in the European Parliament, their reach on TikTok is more than half of all MEPs. So they are much more present. They have more followers. They have more likes. Also, of course, the algorithms of a platform like TikTok lends itself more to radical messages, because the algorithms tend to boost messages that spark a strong emotional reaction. So in that sense, it's not a surprise that these parties are quite popular on such platforms. And indeed, we see that this works. This and of course other strategies of these parties, because we see that in different countries, the voting share for radical right parties is higher among younger voters than on the average of the population.
David Senator, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing. 12:25 here in London. Now it's been a busy week in space this week. Since Monday, we've seen SpaceX's Starship rocket recording its first successful test flight. Boeing's Starliner capsule has docked with the International Space Station despite helium leaks. And China's Chang'e E6 probe is on its way back from the far side of the moon. Well, to bring us up to date with all this, I'm joined by David Whitehouse, science writer and broadcaster. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon.
What a week for you. Where do we begin? I mean, just before we start unpicking each adventure, is there a reason why everything's happened at the same time?
Well, in a way, yes, because this is the year of the moon. And it's the build-up for several years now to return to the moon with people and with spacecraft to analyze the moon and to understand it better. And so China has its own moon program. Elon Musk's Starship is the basis for America to go back to the moon. And Boeing has plans in that direction as well, but its capsule is mainly an Earth transport capsule. So it has not been as busy a time in space like this, perhaps for decades.
And so let's go through each event one by one. Let's start with SpaceX's Starship. It was recording its first successful test flight, let's say politely, after quite a fashion.
Well, that's right. But this is the style we've come to expect from SpaceX and Elon Musk, is that they are pushing the envelope so hard and wanting to do things which, if and when they succeed, will change things so much that they force each mission. They've got a motto: fail fast and learn. And you're right, the last couple of Starship tests with the super booster underneath it haven't gone so well. But what they've done is they've identified why it failed, and they put it together to the next flight. And this flight was mostly there. There's a few bits and pieces that didn't work. So the next test in a couple of months, and they're going at a furious rate of tests, should be better. But certainly a great big step forward for SpaceX's revolutionary heavy rocket and its amazing Starship capsule, which will land on the moon in a few years' time.
Just explain a little bit, you've mentioned there the fact that it needs to land on the moon. The purpose of SpaceX, as other than a major vanity project for Elon Musk, what is it?
Well, actually, it's you're quite right. It was something that only a billionaire could do. And that was the point, because he shook the establishment. In the past, it was national space agencies and governments, and they had fixed contracts that took ages, that didn't deliver and were re-given. SpaceX, they came within one launch of failure, but they persisted, and they've really shaken up the launching to Earth orbit market with all their Starlink satellites. They've captured that market, and now they're trying to move into the market of moving people away from the Earth. So yes, it was the vision of a billionaire, but to be honest, I don't suppose Elon Musk got to be a billionaire by throwing his money away. He sees this as something for the future.
Let's look at Starliner as well. That's Boeing. That also has had quite a bumpy ride, and it had a bumpy ride trying to get to the space station this week.
That's right. Now Boeing is part of America's attempt to have two ways to get to the space station. At the moment, there are three ways, but one of them is Russian, and they don't want to rely on that. So they've got SpaceX's Dragon capsule, and Boeing was the alternative, not quite the backup, the thing they'll use just as often as SpaceX. But this is a 5-year project that's had its problems for many years. We're not quite sure why. Perhaps it was quality control. It shouldn't have happened to Boeing, although we know that Boeing's had problems in other divisions of technical quality. So it worked. There were a few helium leak problems on the way up, but they don't seem to be too bad, and they'll be absolutely delighted that they've got what is a very versatile and useful capsule that will not only go to the space station, actually in space with people for the first time.
Finally, so we've done Starship, we've done Starliner. Let's go to China's trip to the moon, the far side of the moon. How successful was that?
Oh, this is a wonderful unmanned mission to take samples for the first time from the far side of the moon. China owns the far side of the moon. They're the only other country that's landed there a few years ago. And these samples took off a couple of days ago. They're now done a remarkable feat by being transferred from a transfer satellite to the return satellite in orbit around the moon, and that will shortly leave lunar orbit to come back to Earth. This is not only scientific treasure for the samples we're going to learn about the formation of the moon and the solar system, but this is a tour de force to do all this transferring and moving these samples around automatically around the moon. They've got ambitions for the moon, and I'm not sure at the moment who I would bet to put people on the moon first, China or America.
David Whitehouse, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the briefing. Finally, Scotland is bracing itself for an avalanche of Taylor Swift fans, or Swifties, as the superstar kicks off her tour in Edinburgh this evening. Tickets for her Eras tour sold out within hours, generating an estimated billion for gross ticket sales. But O to B Taylor Swift, she's rather a rarity when it comes to levels of success. Pity the Black Keys. They've just cancelled their entire North American tour, as has Jennifer Lopez. So what's going wrong? Well, Chris Black is a journalist and podcaster, and I'm delighted to say he joins us now. Good afternoon, Chris.
Hey, how are you?
Very well, thank you, but not quite as well as Taylor Swift. What's she doing that she's getting so right?
I think it's just the fan engagement and the level that the fans are locked in. And it's also a rite of passage, I think, for a certain type of person. And I think that parents are willing to pay the high ticket prices to keep their kids happy.
Oh, right, okay. So this is a generation of parents being browbeaten so you can go and be a Swiftie. But as a result, what is everybody else getting so wrong?
I think that everyone tends to overplay their hand based on ego. You know, if you've played arenas before at the height of your career, you don't want to take a step back. But unfortunately, that's necessary sometimes. And I think it's a combination of the artists, the managers, the booking agents, and everyone just kind of doing it wrong.
And does that mean that you are surrounded by people, if you are a superstar, you are surrounded by people who perhaps overplay you a little? Or is this something, a sort of a hunger to basically get the marketing machine to work really well?
I mean, if you look at, if you look at, for example, Charlie XCX and Troye Sivan are going on an arena tour that starts soon, and they've created like a fervor around it and they need each other. You know what I mean? The combination is going to help them sell a lot of tickets. And I think that it's a challenging time also because of prices. You know, that's what the consumer is really concerned with, is that tickets are too expensive. Going to see even an indie band costs $100 now. And I think that is really turning people off as well.
And indeed, one wonders whether it is the problem of the arena itself. If you're going to see an indie band, you would, to a certain degree, require a certain level of intimacy and sort of getting down and dirty, one should say, at the gig. But if you can only see your superstar hero from about 3 miles away, it kind of takes the fun away.
I would say that. I mean, I like to go to big stuff because just from an anthropological standpoint, but I think that it is less intimate. And I do feel like it feels like there's, you know, a lesser connection between the artist and the fan.
How much nowadays do performers really rely on live gigs in order to keep themselves out there and make people aware?
Well, that's the other issue. I think that it's such a huge revenue stream. I mean, once streaming took over and revenue from record sales went down significantly, the opportunity to make money is basically touring and merchandise and licensing your songs. You know, I mean, some of these artists, you know, Taylor Swift, Travis Scott, Drake, they're doing $1 million or more a night in merchandise. So it's like the touring is very, very important, not just from a, you know, fan connection standpoint, but also from a monetary standpoint.
Chris Black, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer, Vincent McAviney. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing's back on Monday at the same time. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. Have a great weekend.